William Langland sat with his parchment. It was London, around 1377. He wasn't a man of high society. He saw the city from the ground up. He wrote about what he saw, the real lives of people. In his work, a long poem called Piers Plowman, he described the city's sounds and its people. And he wrote of a character who confessed he didn't know the Lord's Prayer properly. But he did know the taverns of London, and he knew where to find the best food. Not in the grand halls, but on the street. Langland mentioned cooks and their boys crying out, "Hot pies, hot! Good pigs and geese, go dine, go!" This wasn't a quaint scene, it was a lifeline. In 14th century London, thousands of people lived in single rooms. They had no kitchens, they had no ovens, no pots, no way to cook for themselves. Their workday was long, from sunrise to sunset. They needed to eat, so they turned to the streets. The piemen, the cook shop owners, they were the city's kitchen. For a penny, a laborer could buy a hot meat pie. It was fast, it was cheap, it was fuel to get through the day. This was the birth of an industry. It was takeaway food. Centuries before the word existed, these vendors were part of the city's fabric, feeding the masses who were building the cathedrals and paving the roads. They were essential. And the food they sold, born from necessity on those crowded, dirty streets, has a history that stretches all the way to today. Number 10. A pie was just a box you couldn't always eat. John Day Bindon was a cook. He lived and worked in London in the year 1356. His world was the Bridge Ward, a crowded section of the city near the Thames. John was a member of the Cook's Guild, a powerful organization that tried to control the city's food trade. He wasn't just cooking for nobles in a great house. His main business was his cook shop, a small, open-fronted stall facing the street. Here, he sold food to people who couldn't cook for themselves. His biggest seller was the meat pie. The pies John sold were different from what we know. The pastry, called a coffin, was not always meant to be eaten. It was a functional container. The flour was coarse, mixed with hot water and suet to make a tough, dense dough. It was more like a hard shell or a disposable pot. John would shape this dough into a deep, straight-sided container with a thick lid. Its job was to hold the filling and protect it while it cooked in his large communal oven. Ovens were rare in private homes. Most people in his neighborhood lived in a single rented room. They relied on men like John. The filling was the main event. What went into it was a source of constant suspicion. The guild had rules, strict rules. In 1347, the city authorities declared that piemen could only use good, fresh meat. They listed the acceptable fillings: beef, lamb, pork, veal, rabbit, and capon. But John knew the temptation. The profit margin was thin. Good meat was expensive. There were stories, everyone heard them, stories of cooks using rotten meat disguised with heavy spices. And spices like pepper, cloves, and mace were expensive, but a little went a long way to hide the taste of meat that was past its prime. Some even whispered of cooks using cats or dogs. This was probably rare, but the fear was real. In 1327, a London cook was publicly shamed for selling a pie made from bad meat. He was put in the pillory, a wooden frame in a public square, and forced to hold the rotten pie under his nose all day. The public threw garbage at him. John D. Bindon didn't want that. He tried to follow the rules. His day started before dawn. He would buy his meat from the butchers at Eastcheap, the city's main meat market. He haggled for prices on scraps and offcuts. Back at his shop, he would chop the meat and mix it with what he had. Maybe some onions, some stock, maybe a few dried herbs. Then he'd make the tough pastry coffins, fill them, and put the lids on, leaving a small hole for steam to escape. He'd slide them into his wood-fired oven. By mid-morning, the smell would attract his first customers. Your apprentices from the nearby workshops, boatmen from the river, laborers on their way to a job. They would pay a penny or two for a hot pie. They might eat the filling with a spoon or their fingers and then toss the hard crust away for the dogs or pigs that roamed the streets. Or, if they were very hungry, they might eat the crust too. It wasn't tasty, but it was food. John also faced competition. Besides other guild cooks, there were the pastlers, bakers who specialized in pastry, and there were the street hawkers, women mostly called hucksters. They would buy pies from cooks like John and resell them in other parts of the city, carrying them in baskets. The city tried to regulate this. In 1380, a rule was made that no one could reheat a pie from the day before. Everything had to be sold fresh. An official called an ale conner would also inspect food stalls. If they found a bad pie, they could seize it. John saw it happen. He once saw a huckster's entire basket of pies confiscated and given to the prisoners at Newgate Prison. The assumption was that even prisoners deserved better than what she was selling. The pies themselves were a reflection of the medieval world. They were practical. They were a way to stretch a small amount of meat. They were a way to cook food without an oven at home, and they showed the social divide. The nobility ate pies too, but theirs were different. Their pastry was finer, made with butter and better flour. Their fillings were exotic venison, swan, peacock, songbirds. Sometimes live birds were put inside a cooked pie crust just before serving, so they would fly out when it was cut open at the table. It was pure theater. For John's customers on the street, the pie was not theater. It was survival. It was a hot meal in a cold world, a simple, cheap source of energy. He was part of a huge informal system that kept the city running one penny pie at a time. He wasn't getting rich, but he made a living. And his food, in its most basic form, was a direct ancestor of the hand-held meat pies and pasties sold all over the world today. Number 9, a prayer was twisted into bread. Brother Ansgar was a monk. He lived in a monastery in southern Gaul, what would later become France, around the year 610. His monastery was a place of quiet contemplation, but also of work. The monks farmed their own land, brewed their own ale, and baked their own bread. Ansgar was in charge of teaching the local children their catechism, their basic prayers. The children were restless, and it was hard to make them focus. Ansgar wanted to find a way to reward them when they learned a prayer correctly. He went to the monastery's kitchen. He took some leftover bread dough. It was a simple mix of flour, water, and salt. He didn't want to make a simple roll of bread. He wanted to make something special, something with meaning. He thought about the way people prayed. They crossed their arms over their chests. He took a strip of the dough and folded it to look like a person's arms in prayer. The shape was a simple loop with 2 arms crossed in front. He baked these little bread twists. They were soft and chewy. He called them prediola, a Latin word meaning little rewards. He gave one to each child who could recite their prayers perfectly. The children loved them. The prediola became a powerful incentive. The idea spread. Other monasteries in the region started making prediola. As the centuries passed, the practice moved from France into the lands that would become Germany. The Germans changed the name. Prediola became pretzel or pretzel. The meaning was the same, a little reward. For a long time, pretzels remained a food associated with the church. They were simple, made without eggs or dairy, so they were perfect for eating during Lent, the 40-day period of fasting before Easter. The 3 holes in the pretzel shape were even said to represent the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. By the 12th century, the pretzel had moved out of the monastery and into the city. Bakers' guilds were forming in German towns. These guilds were very strict. They controlled who could be a baker, what ingredients they could use, and what prices they could charge. The pretzel became one of their signature items. In 1111, the Bakers' Guild in Swabia, a region in southwestern Germany, adopted the pretzel into its official crest. This showed how important the simple bread twist had become. Street vendors began to sell pretzels. They were a perfect street food. They were easy to carry, easy to eat with your hands, and they were cheap. A pretzel vendor, often a woman or a boy, would carry a large wooden stick on their shoulder. The fresh, warm pretzels would be threaded onto the stick. They would walk through the crowded market squares, shouting their wares. People bought them as a snack. They were eaten plain or sometimes with mustard. The making of pretzels became a protected craft. The recipe was still simple flour, water, yeast, and salt, but the process was key. The dough was rolled thin, twisted into its unique shape, and then, just before baking, it was dipped in a lye solution. Lye is a strong alkali. It was made by soaking wood ashes in water. This lye bath was the secret. It gave the pretzel its distinctive dark brown, shiny crust and its unique, slightly tangy flavor. It was a dangerous step. Lye is caustic and can cause burns, but it was essential for a true pretzel. There are many stories about pretzels from this time. One legend from the 15th century tells of a baker in Vienna. The city was under siege by Ottoman forces in 1529. The baker was working late at night in his basement bakery. He heard a faint rumbling and digging sound. He realized the enemy was trying to tunnel under the city walls. He alerted the city's defenders. The tunnel was discovered, the attack was stopped, and the city was saved. The king, as a reward, gave the baker and his guild a special honor. He allowed them to create a coat of arms. They chose the pretzel. Whether that story is true or not, it shows how the pretzel was tied to the identity of bakers and their cities. It was more than just bread. It started as a monk's simple reward for children. It became a symbol of a baker's skill, a staple of city life, and a food that could be found on nearly every street corner in the German-speaking world. It was a food for everyone, from children to kings, born from a simple act of encouragement in a quiet monastery centuries before. Number 8, a poor man's feast, was scooped from the river. Agnes was a mussel-wife. She lived in London in the 15th century. She didn't have a shop or a stall. Her business was a large wicker basket. Every morning she would go down on the banks of the River Thames at low tide. The river was the city's highway, its water source, and its sewer, but it was also a source of food. On the muddy banks, there were vast beds of mussels and oysters. They were free for the taking. Agnes, along with dozens of other women, would wade into the mud. They would use small rakes or just their hands to gather the shellfish. They filled their baskets with mussels. And oysters were common too. In medieval London, oysters were not a luxury food. They were the opposite. They were incredibly cheap and abundant. They were a primary source of protein for the city's poor. A person could buy a dozen oysters for a penny. They were the fast food of their day. After filling her basket, Agnes would walk back into the city. She would find a spot on a busy street, perhaps near London Bridge or in the market at Cheapside. She didn't cook the mussels. She sold them raw by the scoop. Her customers were laborers, soldiers, servants, and anyone else who needed a quick, cheap meal. They would buy a small pile of mussels, open them with a small knife, and eat them right there on the street. It was simple and filling, but it was also risky. The Thames was heavily polluted. All the city's waste ended up in the river. Animal entrails from the butchers, dyes from the cloth workers, human waste from the latrines that overhung the water. The shellfish were filter feeders. They absorbed everything in the water. Eating them raw was a gamble. Food poisoning was common. People got sick. Some died. The city authorities knew this was a problem. In 1419, the mayor of London, Richard Dick Whittington, issued a proclamation. He was a real person, a wealthy merchant who was mayor 4 times. He was concerned about public health. His proclamation forbade the sale of shellfish during the summer months, specifically from May to September. People had observed for centuries that shellfish were more likely to be spoiled and cause illness in warm weather. This was long before anyone understood bacteria. They just knew the risk was higher when it was hot. The rule was never eat shellfish in a month without an R in it. This old saying dates back to this period of practical observation. Agnes had to find other work during those months. Maybe she sold fruit or vegetables, but when September came, she was back at the riverbank. And the demand was always there. Mussels and oysters were cooked as well. They were put into pies, stews, and soups. A common dish was mussel pottage, a thick stew made with mussels, onions, and breadcrumbs. Taverns sold it. Street vendors ladled it out from large pots. The sheer quantity of shellfish consumed was staggering. Archaeologists excavating medieval sites in London find huge pits filled with oyster and mussel shells. In one site near the Thames, they found a pit that was 6 feet deep and contained an estimated 1.2 million oyster shells. This was the accumulated garbage from a nearby tavern or a few houses over a period of a few decades. It shows that oysters were not an occasional treat. They were a daily staple for a large part of the population. For Agnes, being a mussel-wife was a hard life. It was cold, wet work. The competition was fierce, and she was at the very bottom of the city's economic ladder. She was an unregulated street seller, often viewed with suspicion by the established guilds, but she provided a vital service. She and women like her were part of a system that fed the city's working poor. They took a resource that was free and plentiful, the bounty of a dirty river, and turned it into calories that fueled the city's growth. The food she sold was a world away from the banquet halls of the rich, but it was just as important. It was the taste of the river, the taste of poverty, and the taste of survival on the medieval street. Number 7, a church wafer was made sinfully delicious. Bowdoin was an ironsmith. He lived in the city of Bruges in the 13th century. Bruges in Flanders was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe. It was a center of the cloth trade. Its streets were crowded with merchants from all over the world. Baudouin was not a merchant. He was a craftsman. His specialty was making oublie irons. An oublie was a thin, crisp wafer, a bit like an unconsecrated communion wafer sold outside churches. The name came from the Latin oblatum, meaning offering. These wafers were simple. The batter was just flour and water. At street vendors called bliers would pour a spoonful of this batter onto a hot iron, press it shut, and cook it over a small charcoal fire for a few seconds. The irons that Baudouin made were like long-handled tongs with two flat circular plates at the end. His skill was in engraving the inside of these plates. He would carve intricate designs into the iron family crests, religious symbols, geometric patterns. When the wafer was cooked, the design was pressed into it. The oubliers were a common sight, especially on saints' days and festivals. They would set up their small fires right outside the church doors. As people came out of the service, they would buy a hot, fresh wafer. It was a light, simple snack. The competition between them was intense. They would shout and try to attract customers. It got so bad that in some French cities, like Paris, a law had to be passed. The law stated that an oublier could not set up their stall within 2 lengths of a toys about 12 feet of another. This was to prevent fights from breaking out. Sometime in the 13th or 14th century, someone had a new idea. The simple flour and water batter was bland. What if you added other ingredients? What if you added eggs, milk, or butter? What if you added honey or sugar for sweetness? This changed everything. The humble oublie began to transform into something richer, something more like a dessert. The new richer batter was thicker. It needed a different kind of iron to cook properly. Baudouin and other ironsmiths started getting new requests. They needed to make the plates of the iron thicker and deeper. Instead of a flat, smooth surface for a thin wafer, they started carving a grid pattern and a honeycomb pattern. In Old French, a honeycomb was called a wafre. This name connected to the pattern eventually became waffle. The grid pattern wasn't just for decoration, it had a purpose. It created more surface area so the waffle cooked more evenly. And the little pockets were perfect for holding butter, honey, or fruit. The waffle was born. It was still a street food, but it was a more indulgent one. Waffle vendors, or gaufriers, as they were called in French, became just as common as the old oubliers. They were especially popular in the Low Countries, Flanders, Brabant, and Holland. The food they sold was hot, sweet, and comforting. It was an affordable luxury for the common person. The waffle irons themselves became more and more elaborate. Baudouin might have carved a simple crosshatch at first, but soon customers wanted deeper pockets, more complex patterns. The irons were heavy, made of cast iron, and required real strength to handle all day over a hot fire. A good waffle vendor needed a strong arm. The waffle's connection to the church didn't completely disappear. Waffles were often eaten on religious holidays, but they had become a food of celebration and pleasure, not just a simple snack. They were sold at fairs, at markets, and on street corners. The smell of them cooking, a sweet, buttery smell, would have been a common part of the city soundscape, mixing with the noise of carts and the shouts of other vendors. For Baudouin the ironsmith, this was good for business. He had to innovate. He had to create new designs for a new kind of food. His craft was directly linked to the evolution of what people ate on the street. He probably never thought that the patterned iron plates he was forging would give a name to a food that would become famous around the world. He was just a craftsman, meeting a demand from the vendors who were feeding the people of his bustling city. The waffle began as a simple, pious wafer, but on the streets of medieval Europe, it became something much more. It became a treat. Number 6, a city's pride was stuffed into a casing. Hans was a Metzger. He was a master butcher in the city of Nuremberg in the year 1313. His life was governed by the rules of his guild, one of the most powerful and respected in the city. Being a butcher in a medieval German city was a serious business. The health of the citizens depended on the quality of the meat. And nothing was taken more seriously than the making of sausage, or worst. Nuremberg was famous for its sausages, specifically for its small, thin bratwurst. The city council issued a law in 1313 that was incredibly specific. Well, it was a purity law for sausage. It decreed that only the finest, leanest pork meat could be used in the city's official bratwurst. No scraps, no offal, no fillers like bread. The butchers who violated this rule faced severe punishment. They could be heavily fined or even banished from the city. The reputation of Nuremberg's bratwurst was a matter of civic pride and economic importance. In Hanne's workshop was on a narrow street, not far from the main market square. The front of the shop was for selling cuts of meat. The back was where the real work of sausage making happened. The process was laborious. First, the pork was carefully selected. Hans would check the quality himself. Then, the meat was hand chopped, not ground, but finely minced with heavy cleavers. This gave the sausage a coarser, more pleasing texture. The minced pork was then mixed with spices. The exact recipe was a closely guarded secret for each butcher, but the main flavoring was marjoram. Marjoram grew well in the region and gave the Nuremberg bratwurst its signature taste. Salt and pepper were also added. After the meat was seasoned, it was carefully stuffed into a natural casing, usually a sheep's intestine. This was a delicate job. The casing had to be filled tightly, but not so much that it would burst during cooking. The final sausages were small, usually no longer than a finger and weighing about an ounce. Once the sausages were made, they weren't sold raw in his shop. They were destined for the street. Hans would sell them to bratwurst kuck or little sausage kitchens. These were small establishments, often just a window or a stall with a charcoal grill. They were the fast food joints of medieval Nuremberg. A person could walk up and buy a specific number of sausages. The standard serving was 6, 8, or 12. The sausages were grilled over a beechwood fire. The cook would turn them constantly with a small pair of tongs until they were browned and cooked through. They were served on a pewter plate or, more commonly, in a weckle, a hard bread roll. The roll was cut in half, the sausages placed inside, and it was often served with a dollop of mustard. It was a perfect hand-held meal. It was hot, savory, and cheap. Factory workers, merchants, and city guards all relied on the bratwurst stalls for their daily lunch. The city's control was absolute. The guild inspectors could show up at Hans's shop at any time. They would check his meat, his scales, and the cleanliness of his workshop. They would even weigh the finished sausages to make sure they met the official size standard. This strict quality control is what made Nuremberg sausages famous throughout Germany. People trusted them. Other German cities had their own sausage traditions. Thuringia had its long, thick bratwurst seasoned with caraway and garlic. Frankfurt had its Frankfurter, a thin smoked pork sausage that would later become the hot dog. Each city's sausage was a reflection of its local ingredients and its local regulations. The guild system, while restrictive, created a culture of quality and consistency. For Hans the butcher, making sausage was not just a job. It was a craft with a long tradition and a set of rules that could not be broken. He was a link in a chain that connected the pig farmer, the spice merchant, and the hungry person on the street. His work ensured that when someone bought a bratwurst from a smoking grill in the market square, they were getting a safe, high-quality product. That simple sausage in a roll was more than just food. It was a product of a whole system of medieval urban life, the guilds, the city regulations, and the daily needs of the people. It was a taste of Nuremberg itself. Number 5, a fairy tale treat was carved from wood and spice. And Elsbeth was not a baker by trade. She was a farmer's wife who lived near the German city of Ulm in the 15th century. But once a year, during the city's large church fair, she became a gingerbread maker. The fair was a huge event. It drew people from all the surrounding villages. It was a time for celebration, for trade, and for special foods that you couldn't get every day. For Elsbeth, it was a chance to make some extra money. Gingerbread was not a new food. It had been around for centuries. Crusaders returning from the Middle East in the 11th century had brought back ginger and other spices. At first, these spices were incredibly expensive, a luxury only for the very rich, but by the 15th century, trade routes had expanded. Spices were still costly, but they were more accessible. A woman like Elsbeth could afford to buy a small amount of ground ginger, cinnamon, and cloves for a special occasion. Her recipe was for a hard, crisp gingerbread, more like a cookie than a cake. The main ingredient was honey. Sugar was still a rare luxury. Honey was the common sweetener. She would mix the honey with rye flour and the precious spices. The dough was very stiff. She would knead beat it for a long time until it was smooth. The magic of her gingerbread was not just in the taste, but in the shape. Elsbeth's husband, a woodworker, would spend the winter evenings carving intricate wooden molds for her. These weren't simple cookie cutters, they were works of folk art. He would carve molds in the shape of knights on horseback, kings and queens, flowers, and animals. His most popular molds were of saints, especially St. Nicholas. People would buy these as a treat for their children on the saint's feast day. Making the gingerbread was a two-person job. Elsbeth would press the stiff dough firmly into the wooden mold. She had to make sure it filled every tiny detail of the carving. Her husband would then use a thin wire to cut the excess dough from the back of the mold. And then he would carefully tap the mold on a wooden board, and the shaped gingerbread would fall out. The image was now pressed into the dough. They would make hundreds of these and bake them in their home's large hearth oven until they were hard and dry. This hardness meant they would last for a long time. They were easy to transport to the fair without breaking. At the fair, Elsbeth would set up a small wooden table. She would lay out her gingerbread figures on a clean linen cloth. Some of them she decorated. She would make a simple white icing from egg whites and a little sugar, and use a feather to paint details on the figures. Sometimes she would even use a small amount of gold leaf, an expensive touch, to highlight the crown on a king or the halo on a saint. These were called fairings, special gifts to be bought at a fair. The gingerbread was popular with everyone. Children begged their parents for a gingerbread night. Young men would buy a gingerbread heart for a young woman they were courting. The act of eating the gingerbread figure was sometimes symbolic. Eating a gingerbread animal was thought to give you the strength of that animal. These were folk beliefs mixed in with the fun of the fair. The city of Ulm, along with Nuremberg, became a center of the gingerbread trade. Guilds of professional gingerbread bakers called Lebkuchler were established. They took the craft to a new level. They created huge, elaborate gingerbread scenes, almost like sculptures. But the tradition started with people like Elsbeth, making a special product for a special occasion. The gingerbread she sold was very different from the soft, chewy gingerbread we know today. It was hard, spicy, and meant to be savored slowly. It was a taste of the exotic, a little bit of the far-off lands the spices came from. For a farmer or a craftsman at the fair, it was a small, affordable taste of a world beyond their own. It was a piece of art that you could eat, made from a simple dough and a hand-carved piece of wood. It was a street food that was also a story, a tradition, and a small piece of magic. Number 4, a soldier's meal was cooked on his sword. Yusuf was a soldier. He was part of a Seljuk Turk army in Anatolia in the 11th century. His life was spent on the move, in military camps, not in cities, with markets and kitchens. The food he ate had to be simple, portable, and easy to cook over an open fire. His army, like many nomadic and military groups in the region, had a clever way of cooking meat. They would get a ration of mutton or lamb. They didn't have pots and pans for stewing, but every soldier had a sword. Yusuf would take small chunks of the meat and thread them onto his sword, or sometimes a long dagger. He might put a piece of onion or a chunk of fat between the pieces of meat if he had them. Then he and his fellow soldiers would prop their swords over a campfire. They would turn the sword slowly, roasting the meat directly over the flames. The fat would drip down, sizzle, and create smoke that flavored the meat. This method of cooking was ancient, it was practical, the sword was a ready-made skewer, the fire was the only cooking source they had. The small chunks of meat cooked quickly. When it was done, Yusuf would slide the hot, charred meat off his sword and onto a piece of flatbread, if he was lucky enough to have some. This was a kebab. The word itself, in Turkic and Persian languages, is related to roasting or grilling meat. This was the original shish kebab, or sis kebab in Turkish, which literally means skewer roast. As the Seljuk Turks and later the Ottoman Turks conquered and settled in cities like Constantinople, later Istanbul, they brought their food with them. The soldiers' simple campfire meal moved into the urban kitchen and onto the street. In the bustling markets of Istanbul, Baghdad, and Damascus, street vendors set up charcoal grills. They didn't use swords, but they used long, flat, metal skewers. They would thread marinated chunks of lamb onto these skewers and grill them to order. Ibn Battuta, a famous Arab traveler and scholar in the 14th century, wrote about his travels. While he didn't specifically describe kebabs as a street food in the way we think of it, he described the foods available in the markets of the places he visited. He noted the widespread availability of roasted mutton. In Delhi, he wrote that the royal kitchens would prepare thousands of pounds of meat daily, much of it roasted and served with bread. The basic concept was widespread. The street kebab stall became a fixture of Middle Eastern cities. The vendor, often called an usta or master, would have his grill set up. He would have skewers of meat ready to go. The meat was usually marinated in yogurt, lemon juice, olive oil, and spices like cumin and sumac. This marinade not only added flavor, but also helped to tenderize the meat. A customer would walk up and place an order. The USD would lay the skewer on the hot coals. He would fan the coals to keep them at the right temperature. The smell of the grilling meat and spices would fill the area. When the meat was cooked with a nice char on the outside but still juicy inside, he would take a piece of flatbread, like a pita. He would lay the bread over the skewer and in one quick motion pull the skewer out, leaving the pile of hot meat on the bread. He might add some chopped raw onions, parsley, and a sprinkle of sumac. The customer would fold the bread around the meat and walk away with a hot, satisfying meal. This was the direct ancestor of the modern kebab. It was fast, it was flavorful, and it used the city's available resources. The vertical rotisserie of the doner kebab wouldn't be invented until centuries later in the Ottoman Empire. But the foundation was laid by soldiers like Yusuf. His practical solution to cooking in the field using a sword as a cooking tool evolved into one of the world's most popular street foods. It was a meal born of necessity, perfected in the city, and a testament to the simple, powerful combination of meat, fire, and bread. Number 3, a miner's lunchbox was made of pastry. Gwennon was a miner's wife. She lived in a small cottage in Cornwall, in the southwest of England, in the 16th century. This was a bit later than the high medieval period, but the food she made had roots that went back centuries. Her husband, Talan, worked in a tin mine. His work was deep underground. It was dark, dirty, and dangerous. He would leave home before the sun came up and not return until after it set. He needed a substantial meal to take with him, something he could eat deep in the mine without a plate or cutlery. Gwennon's solution was the pasty. The pasty she made was a masterpiece of practical design. The pastry was key. And she made it with flour and a hard fat like suet or lard. It was a tough, durable pastry, not light and flaky. It had to be strong enough to survive being knocked around in a cloth bag on Talan's journey to the mine and down the ladders into the earth. The filling was simple and hearty. She would use whatever she had. Usually, it was finely chopped beef, potatoes, sweet or root vegetable like a turnip, and onions. She seasoned it with salt and pepper. Potatoes were not common in England until later, so in earlier centuries she might have used other root vegetables. She would place this raw filling on one half of a rolled out circle of pastry. Then came the most important part. She would fold the other half of the pastry over the filling to create a half-moon shape. Then she would crimp the curved edge. She didn't just pinch it shut, she would create a thick rope-like crust along the edge. This thick crust had a very specific purpose. Talan's hands were covered in dirt from the mine. Tin mining involved arsenic, a poison. He couldn't wash his hands before he ate. The thick, crimped edge of the pasty was designed to be a handle. He would hold the pasty by the crust, eat the main body of it, and then throw the dirty crust away. The crust was a disposable, edible handle. Sometimes Gwennon would get creative. She would put the savory filling in one end of the pasty. In the other end, she would put something sweet, like a bit of jam or a few chopped apples. This way, Talan had a main course and a dessert all in one package. He would eat from one end to the other. People would sometimes initial their pasties by carving a letter into the pastry before baking so the miners wouldn't mix them up. The pasty was the perfect all-in-one meal. The dense pastry kept the filling hot for hours. It was like a primitive thermos. Talan, sitting in the dark of the mine, could have a hot filling meal halfway through his long shift. It was a taste of home, a piece of warmth and comfort deep underground. While the pasty is most famous for its connection to Cornish miners, its history as a handheld pie is much older. Savory pies were common all over medieval Europe, but the Cornish perfected this specific form, driven by the unique needs of their main industry. The pasty wasn't really a street food in a city. It was a portable meal for a rural industrial worker. It was food for the road, or in this case, for the mine shaft. The wives of the miners would make dozens of these at a time. The smell of baking pasties would have filled the small villages. Children would sometimes take the hot pasties to the mine entrance at midday for their fathers. The pasty became so central to Cornish identity that it's protected by law today. A genuine Cornish pasty has to be made in Cornwall and follow a specific recipe. For Gwennon, making the pasty was a daily act of care. It was a way to provide for her husband in a place she couldn't go. The food itself told a story. It spoke of the hard life of a miner, the danger of his work, and the ingenuity required to survive. It was a simple, humble food born not in a bustling city market, but in a small cottage kitchen designed for a man working in the dark heart of the earth. Number 2, a peasant's pancake was made from a black grain. Marie lived in Brittany, a region in the northwest of France, in the 14th century. The land there was not very fertile. The soil was acidic and poor. It was not good for growing wheat. The grain used to make the fine white bread for the rich. But another grain grew well there. It was called sarrasin in French, or buckwheat. It wasn't actually a type of wheat. It was the seed of a flowering plant. When ground into flour, it was dark, almost gray, and had a strong, nutty, earthy flavor. For Marie and her family, buckwheat was their staple food. They were peasants. They worked the land for a local lord. Their diet was simple. They ate what they could grow, and they grew a lot of buckwheat. The most common way they ate it was in the form of a galette. A galette was a thin, wide pancake. It was the bread of Brittany. Marie's kitchen was the hearth in the center of her small one-room stone house. She didn't have an oven. She had a galette, a flat, circular stone or piece of cast iron that she would place over the fire. To make the galettes, she would mix the dark buckwheat flour with water and a bit of salt. The batter was very thin and liquid. She would pour a ladleful of this batter onto the hot stone. Then, using a small wooden rake called a rozzle, she would quickly spread the batter into a large, thin circle. It cooked in less than a minute. She would flip it with a wooden spatula and cook the other side. These galettes were eaten every day at every meal. For breakfast, Marie might serve them plain or with a little butter if they were lucky. For the main meal of the day, she would use the galette as a plate. She would place a cooked filling in the center and fold the edges over it. The filling was whatever they had. Maybe a single egg, some cooked onions, a few mushrooms from the forest, or a small piece of salted pork. On special occasions, they might have a galette with a piece of sausage. The galette was the perfect food for a poor family. Buckwheat was cheap and easy to grow. The galettes were quick to make, they were filling, and they were versatile. They could be a simple bread, a container for a savory filling, or even a dessert with a smear of honey. The galette eventually moved from the peasant cottage to the market stall. In the small towns of Brittany, vendors would set up their hot stones and make galettes for people to buy. They were an early form of fast food. A farmer coming into town for the market could buy a hot galette with a sausage in it for a quick, cheap lunch. These stalls were called creperies, though. At first, they sold mostly the savory buckwheat galettes. The sweet crepe, made with white wheat flour, milk, and eggs, was a later development. It was food for the wealthier classes who could afford the more expensive ingredients. For centuries, the dark galette was the food of the common people in Brittany. The process of making them was a real skill. An experienced galette maker like Marie could spread the batter so thin it was almost transparent. It was a rhythm she learned from her mother, and one she would teach her own daughters. The sound of the batter hitting the hot stone, the quick scrape of the roselle, the flip of the spatula, it was the daily music of her kitchen. The galette tells a story of place. It's a food that could only have come from Brittany. It was born from the poor soil, the hardy grain that grew there, and the needs of the people who worked the land. It wasn't created for a bustling city street. It was created out of rural necessity. But its simplicity and versatility made it a perfect food to sell in a market, a hot, satisfying meal that could be held in one hand. It was the taste of the countryside brought into the town. Number 1, a Lenten treat was fried in a pot of oil. Thomas was a fritteur. He lived in London in the late 14th century. His job was to fry things. He didn't have a proper shop. He had a small stall, just a table and a tripod holding a large cauldron of hot oil or lard over a charcoal brazier. He was a specialist. He sold fritters or crisps, as they were sometimes called. These were small pieces of batter or food coated in batter, deep fried until golden and crisp. His busiest time of the year was Shrovetide, the few days before the start of Lent. Lent was a 40-day period of fasting when people were forbidden from eating meat, eggs, and dairy. Shrove Tuesday, the day before Lent began, was a day for feasting. It was a time to use up all the rich foods in the house that would otherwise spoil. People made pancakes, and for those who didn't have their own kitchen, they bought fritters from men like Thomas. Thomas's basic batter was simple. It was flour mixed with ale and a little salt. The fermenting ale helped to make the batter light. He would drop spoonfuls of this batter into the hot fat. They would puff up into irregular golden shapes. He would scoop them out with a slotted spoon, let the excess fat drip off, and sell them hot and greasy in a paper cone or on a leaf. But he also made more elaborate fritters. His most popular ones were apple fritters. He would take a thick slice of apple, dip it in the batter, and fry it. The apple would become soft and sweet inside the crisp, fried coating. He would sprinkle them with a little honey or a pinch of expensive sugar if the customer paid extra. These were a real treat. He might also use other fruits like pears or even vegetables like parsnips or onions. Being a fridor was a smelly, dangerous job. The hot fat could splatter and cause serious burns. The smoke from his brazier was thick. He was part of the landscape of fast food vendors that, the writer William Langland described. He catered to people in a hurry, people who wanted something hot and savory to eat on the go. The city authorities were wary of men like Thomas. The quality of his ingredients was always in question. What kind of fat was he using? Was it fresh or was it old and rancid? In 1378, the cooks and pie bakers of London petitioned the mayor. They complained about the friteurs. They claimed that the street vendors were selling fritters made with the worst and most corrupt offal, which caused grievous sickness in those who ate them. They were likely exaggerating to protect their own businesses, but the fear was real. The city had few ways to regulate a man with a pot of hot oil on a street corner. Thomas also made savory fritters. He might mix chopped herbs or cheese into his batter. Sometimes he would get scraps of meat or fish from the larger cook shops, dip them in batter, and fry them. This was a way to use up leftovers and turn them into a new saleable product. This practice of deep frying food in batter was a common way to cook and preserve food across Europe. In Italy, they had frittelle. In Spain, buñuelos. The basic idea was the same. For his customers, a fritter was an indulgence. It was fatty, it was hot, and it was satisfying. In a time when fat was a precious source of calories, a deep-fried food was a luxury. It was a quick burst of energy for a laborer or a special treat for a child during a festival. It was the kind of food that felt like a celebration. Thomas the Fritteur was at the lowest end of the food selling chain. He was not a guild member. He had no permanent shop. He was a mobile operator following the crowds. But the food he sold was a direct ancestor of so many modern foods. Their donuts, tempura, fish and chips, they all share a common history with the simple, greasy fritters sold from a cauldron on a medieval London street. His food wasn't fancy, it wasn't always trusted, but it was hot, it was cheap, and on a cold day, it was exactly what people wanted. It was the simple, universal pleasure of fried dough.